Steve, give us some context as an authority on the ADA. Why was it important to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act? What was happening in the country at the time?
Well, in 1974, the HEW, then HEW, passed what was called the 504 regulations. And one paragraph in it prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities by recipients of federal financial assistance. So it meant, if the federal government funded a program, then you couldn't discriminate. But it was limited. It was very, very, very limited. And from 1974 until 1990, basically, the enforcement of and the elimination of discrimination against people with disability was quite restricted. In 1990, they took basically the same regulations and made it into a statutory provisions of the law, and basically though expanded it that you didn't have to just be a recipient. No one could discriminate. So it basically expanded it quite a bit. And it was very important because even though a lot of progress was made between 74 and 1990, there was still an incredible amount of discrimination going on in this country. And it really took some very, very famous people, Justin Dart, for example, and Lex Friedman, and EDAPT, which was the disability advocacy group that basically organized the demonstrations in front of Congress, where I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but in 1990, in order to get the bill passed and enacted, hundreds of people with disabilities got out of the wheelchairs and climbed and pulled themselves up the steps of Congress, pleading with Congress to enact a disability discrimination. Now, you have to remember that the racial discrimination prohibitions came in the 60s. The women's came in the early 70s. So you had, and there was always religious prohibition against discrimination, but you never had a disabled discrimination until the ADA was enacted in 1990.
Which is not that long ago.
Well, it wasn't that long ago, correct. And a lot of progress has been made since 1990 in terms of attitudes, in terms of structures. I mean, I brought the curb cut case in 1992 that basically meant if you're in a wheelchair, you're going to be able to get on and off the pavement and go across the street without worrying about falling out of your wheelchairs. And also, there's been a lot of progress made in terms of attitudinal change, language change. There's been a good deal of progress. There's still much more to go.
Absolutely. Let's talk about that wheelchair case. You argued a case, as you said, in the early 90s to make sidewalks wheelchair accessible, a fight that many are still having today. Have the challenges for people with mental and physical disabilities changed?
Somewhat so. They become more difficult to win in court. When you say the fight we're still having today, most of the circuits after 1992 throughout the country basically adopted the decision that we won in the Third Circuit and Federal Appeals Court, so that whenever streets are resurfaced, that's the opportunity to make the pavements to those streets accessible and requires curb cuts to be installed. That's been pretty effective throughout the country. Are there different changes? Yeah. The mentally ill is still, there's been a lot of progress, but it's still a big problem, and the stigma attached to it is quite profound, much more than physical disabilities, I think.
You talk about these attitudes a lot. What about the issue of paternalism? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Paternalism is quite rampant. It has always been. It's a historical thing, and it is, you've always had a lot of pity on society has had with people who are clearly disabled. And you see that much more in physically disabled than you see in mentally disabled, because mentally disabled, there's no signs that the person necessarily no signs.
No
that the
outward
person
signs, right.
Yeah.
So then how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected this conversation around disabled Americans? Is it healthcare rationing or proper accommodations for working from home or vaccine mandates? Is it all three of these things?
All three of them. One of the things, I mean, it's interesting you would mention these three, but the one that we always fought for from 1990 on was the accommodations. And a lot of disabled people, you know, are quite smart. They just maybe can't get in and out of their house adequately, or it takes them enormous amount of time to travel to get to work. So they have asked their employers historically for accommodations to be able to work at home. Well, that was a major fight. And people, you know, always objected. Employers always objected. We won a number of those cases, but it was always a struggle. Now with the pandemic and everyone working at home, you know, it's just the accommodation has been just easily done for everyone. And my hope and expectation is after the pandemic is over, working from home for people with disabilities will be
that the
much
accommodation
easier to
will
accept.
stick. Absolutely.
Okay.
You've also been engaged with groups like Not Dead Yet to combat the threat of the legalization of doctor-assisted suicide and the threat that it poses to the rights of the disabled. Where is that fight today? What can you tell us about it?
Well, that fight today is still there. I don't know, 8 or 10 states now have, I don't know the exact number, I haven't kept track, basically have provisions for physician-assisted suicide, quite structured in terms of how it's done. It's from my point of view, it's a terrible practice, but it's not been as bad for people with disabilities as I expected. It's still there, and every now and then we do hear of a person with a disability who the doctor or the hospital doesn't want to operate, doesn't value their lives, and does suggest physician-assisted suicide. But it's Not Dead Yet has been a terrific roadblock for the Kevorkians of this country, and it's been effective.
Well, Steve, we're grateful for your legacy of advocacy and perseverance. You inspire us, and we'll be watching this very, very closely, especially as we discussed with the issues associated with the pandemic. Thank you for joining us.